Chapter 444. Obsidian Tower. Sonny stood naked on the rocky surface of the dark island. He grimaced and looked at his body, which was a map of burns, some more severe than others, then summoned the puppeteer's shroud. Not wishing for the soft fabric to touch the worst of his wounds, he left it the way it had been during the latter stages of his journey through the sky below, with the leather elements gone and the upper garment undone and tied around his waist. This time, his body was wrapped in shadows and appeared black, as if cut from the same obsidian that the dark island consisted of. The coils of the soul serpent seemed to shimmer as the essence flowed through them. A moment later, Saint stepped from behind him and moved forward, summoning the midnight shard as she walked. Knowing how badly his soul was damaged, Sonny decided to keep the broken oath locked away for a while, so the shadow was not surrounded by the destructive aura anymore. He was also not in any shape to fight himself, at least not very effectively, and that was why the austere Takai was currently in the hands of the taciturn demon. If push came to shove, Sonny would either use the moonlight shard or command the soul serpent to assume the Odachi form. With a heavy sigh, he summoned the endless spring and greedily drank the cold water from it, then leaned forward and poured some on his head. After that, he finally felt like a human once again. All in all, things weren't that bad. He was alive and in one piece, suffering from neither thirst nor hunger. Here on the dark island, the air was pleasantly warm. Bright stars burned in the empty void high above, making for a beautiful view. Right in front of them, the graceful silhouette of the obsidian tower rose from the ground like a black rift in reality. It turned out to be much larger than Sonny had thought, but nowhere near the scale of the Crimson Spire. That cursed thing seemed to be too gargantuan to even exist, while the ancient pagoda was more or less fit to have been built for humans. Well, maybe for extremely tall humans, or tiny giants. As Sonny studied the obsidian tower, Saint tilted her head and stared at the black pagoda, too, her ruby eyes reflecting some strange emotion. Was it recognition? Why would his shadow recognize a tower, hidden in the depths of the abyss below the chained islands? Strange. Sonny frowned, then dismissed the endless spring. He remained motionless for a few moments, then slowly headed toward the tall pagoda. Saint followed. As they walked across the island, Sonny had time to look at the various ruins left on its surface. It was hard to determine what they had been once, but Sonny got the feeling that he wasn't looking at the remains of buildings. More like structures, devices. Their purpose was now impossible to determine, but whatever it had been, he doubted that anyone could have ever lived inside. The closest he could get to putting his feeling in words was that these ruins reminded him most of the bowels of the underground factory his mom had worked in when he was little. Even though the factory was much larger and built of alloy instead of cut blocks of obsidian, not to mention being much more advanced, the sensation was the same. Just what was the purpose of this island? Who lived here? Who built that strange tower? The closer Sonny got to the obsidian tower, the more he was impressed by its graceful beauty. Even though the pagoda was hidden in the depths of the sky below, where very few creatures would have ever seen it, the unknown builder spent time to ensure that it replicated the magnificence of its ivory counterpart perfectly. It would have been breathtaking if it wasn't so menacing. Surrounded by nothing but emptiness and silence, the obsidian tower appeared ominous just by virtue of existing. I am not scared at all. He was, however, thinking about one thing in particular. Which tower was really the replica, and which one was the original? The beautiful white pagoda that flowed high above the chained aisles, or the menacing black one that hid in the darkness below? Maybe he was going to find out. Soon, Sonny and Saint approached the tall gates of the obsidian tower. Nothing attacked them, and no frightening sound came from inside, announcing that something that dwelled beyond the black gates was awakening in hunger. The pagoda was silent, just like the rest of the dark island. The strange thing, though, was that Sunny could not feel any shadows on the other side of the massive door. Not because there weren't any, but because the walls of the tower seemed to shield the interior from his shadow sense. A cold shiver ran down his spine. I have never encountered anything like this before, have I? He hesitated, then approached the black door, summoned the moonlight shard and scratched its surface. A layer of black dust fell down, revealing a much harder and even blacker surface beneath. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Soot. The entire pagoda was covered in a thick layer of soot. He stood motionlessly for a bit, trying to understand what meaning was there in this fact, then simply shrugged and studied the ancient gate. The problem he was facing was that the gate didn't have a handle to open. Neither did it have a keyhole, a bell to ring, or a knocker to announce his arrival. How the hell am I supposed to open it? Without shadow sense, he couldn't use shadow step to simply appear inside. So for the moment, Sunny was stuck. It would be very, very funny to travel all this way only to find out that I can't open a damn door. Right. Slightly embarrassed, he looked at Saint and asked, "Any ideas?" He didn't really expect an answer from the taciturn demon, but to his surprise, the shadow stared at him for a few moments, and then lowered her sword. Then she raised one hand and pointed to her eye. Sunny observed all of that in complete bewilderment, then blinked a couple of times. What does she mean? Then an idea came into his mind. Turning back to the door, he put one hand on it, and then shifted his gaze in a similar manner he did when looking beneath the surface of memories to look at their spellweave. And there, beneath the obsidian surface of the tower's gate, he saw it. A weave. It wasn't the weave of ethereal threads he was used to seeing, though. Instead, it was a much cruder and more primitive version of it, created from very physical diamond strings that stretched beneath the stone surface, creating a beautiful but simple pattern. Sunny had only seen this type of weave one time before. Inside Saint herself. Back when she was just an echo, he had noticed it hidden behind the radiant pattern of the spellweave. He had thought that it was what made the stone warriors alive in the first place. That it was created by the last child of the unknown in the cavernous halls of his dark domain. And that it might have been the precursor of the spell itself, or maybe an imitation of it. Was this tower built by the Lord of the Underworld too, then? Sunny hesitated for a moment, then moved his hand to a particularly bright node of the diamond weave and sent a small amount of shadow essence into it. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the gates of the obsidian tower opened. Visible only to Sunny, the diamond weave beneath the surface of the gate ignited with ghostly light. Almost immediately, a thin vertical crack appeared in the ancient stone. Then the gates silently opened, and a gust of wind hit Sunny in the back. He took a few steps away, hiding behind Saint, and cautiously looked over her shoulder at the dark entrance. Nothing was moving in the darkness. From what he could see, the interior of the obsidian tower seemed quite mundane. As soon as the gate opened, his shadow's sense could finally penetrate the invisible barrier surrounding the graceful pagoda. It didn't detect any danger as well. It really did seem safe. He waited for a few moments, then coughed and waved a hand in front of his face, trying to get the soot that had flown into the air away from it. Well, nothing to worry about then. Let's go. Sunny glanced at Saint, lingered for a second, and added in a polite tone, "Oh, ladies first." The taciturn demon turned her head slightly, stared at him with one ruby eye, then simply walked forward and stepped over the threshold of the ancient tower. Sunny waited for a few moments and followed. Tightly gripping the handle of the moonlight shard, he dove into the darkness that reigned behind the tall frame of the entrance, took a dozen steps forward, and found himself in a wide corridor that seemed to encircle the entire first level of the pagoda. The corridor stretched both far to the left and to the right. Here and there, Sonny could see large doors leading to differently sized rooms that were situated in the direction of the tower's outer wall, all the way to the bends of the corridor. And right in front of him was an intricate wooden gate decorated with beautiful engravings. Behind it was the central hall of the tower. Sonny hesitated for a bit, then pushed the wooden gate, which opened easily and revealed a vast chamber on the other side. That smelly. His eyes widened. Behind the gate was a large hall with a very tall ceiling. As soon as the gate opened, glass lanterns ignited on its walls, filling the interior of the obsidian tower with ghostly blue light. There were various things in the hall, all of which demanded Sonny's attention. There was a stand holding smith's tools and implements, all masterfully crafted from black obsidian and silver. A badly burned work table with a scattering of beautiful soul crystals on its black surface. A stone wall with mysterious schematics cut into it, the cuts themselves so smooth and deep that he couldn't even begin to imagine what had left them behind, let alone what the schematics described. There were strange devices forged from silver and black steel, some of which reminded him of astronomical instruments, but also very mundane things, like chairs, tables, and even something that resembled a very long bed. All of it was perfectly preserved and immaculate, with not a speck of dust anywhere, cleaner than even his own house in the real world was, despite the thousands of years that must have passed since the obsidian tower was visited last. It also all felt slightly wrong. The sizes of everything were almost fit to be used by a human, but slightly different. The shapes of the handles of all the tools were slightly strange. The way the pieces of furniture and equipment were arranged in space filled him with a slight feeling of unease, even though he didn't know why. But Sonny didn't dwell on this for too long. Neither did his gaze linger on any of these items. His attention was pulled toward one specific place. Not too far from him stood a simple wooden table, and on it was all kinds of delicious food. Juicy meat, freshly baked bread, succulent grapes, glass jars of exquisite wine, beautiful pots full of steaming tea, all of it waited for him, as if served only a few seconds ago. Sonny's mouth watered. How is this possible? This has to be an illusion, right? Covered in layers of soot, sweat, and blood, he walked toward the table. His boots left black marks on the pristine floor of the hall. Arriving at his destination, Sonny reached out and grabbed a piece of bread with his dirty hand and greedily devoured it, then took one of the intricate silver goblets and filled it with wine. The rest of the goblets clattered to the floor, thrown off the table by his careless movement. Not paying it any attention, Sonny gulped down the sweet wine and laughed, sending breadcrumbs flying into the air. Ah, this is not bad, really. He would have preferred something without alcohol, but then again, this wine tasted so good. There was a wide grin on Sonny's face, but also dirty traces left by tears. His shoulders trembled. This really hits the spot. He was aware of the fact that the food could have been full of poison but didn't care too much. He was just too hungry, tired, and spent. His body and his soul both hurt too much. He was at his wit's end. Refilling his goblet and grabbing a piece of perfectly roasted meat, he wandered away from the table and took another look at the large hall. There's no one here, right, Saint? The shadow silently walked behind him, vigilantly looking around and keeping the midnight shard ready. But there was nothing to use it against. Sonny wandered for a minute or so and eventually stopped near a large bed covered with black, lavish furs. Dropping the empty goblet on the floor, he hesitated a little and then climbed into the furs. Who's been sleeping in my bed? Sonny dismissed the puppeteer's shroud and lowered his heavy head onto a soft pillow. He wanted to give Saint the command to stand guard, but there was no need. The taciturn demon was already doing exactly that. Before Sonny could think about something else, the exhaustion of the past few weeks took over his mind, and Offering almost no resistance, it slipped easily into the embrace of darkness. The first thing Sonny ended up doing after discovering the obsidian tower and finding his way inside was falling on a bed and going to sleep. He slept well. Sonny slept for a long time, the exhaustion slowly leaving his battered body. After a while, though, his consciousness rose from the deepest layers of slumber, summoned back by pain and thirst. With a sigh, he turned to his other side and tried to go back to sleep. After a few more hours of tossing and turning, though, Sonny was finally awoken by the loud sound of something crashing to the floor. "What is Saint doing?" He reluctantly opened his eyes and sat up. As Sonny's weight shifted, the bed beneath him suddenly broke with a loud crack. He rolled onto the floor with a startled yelp. "Huh!" Standing up, Sonny looked at the broken bed, then at the hall of the obsidian tower, which was now submerged in darkness. A bewildered expression appeared on his face. The room he had entered before had gone through a dramatic transformation while he was asleep. The magical lanterns were now extinguished, and everything inside seemed dilapidated and decrepit, almost on the verge of crumbling to pieces. The magnificent tools and implements had rusted through and deformed. The worktable had collapsed under its own weight. That was the sound which had awoken Sonny. The food he had enjoyed yesterday had turned to dust. The pristine condition of the hall was gone, and now it was full of darkness, debris, and dirt. It was as though eons had passed since he fell asleep. A cold feeling appeared in his chest. Have I slept for 1,000 years? Remembering fairy tales where similar things often happened, Sonny felt a hint of horror, but then thought about it for a few moments and calmed down. No, he had not, judging by how much shadow essence had accumulated in his cores. He slept for about 24 hours straight, which was a lot, but nowhere near 1,000 years. Saint, who was keeping watch nearby, also didn't look as if she had been guarding him for a few centuries. Instead, it was the pagoda itself that had aged, as if an invisible seal that had kept it untouched by the passage of time for all those thousands of years was now broken, and time was finally catching up with it. Time was the most relentless destroyer, after all. Sonny sighed with relief, then grimaced. Curses, I should have eaten more yesterday, much, much more. All that delicious food wasted. Shaking his head dejectedly, Sonny looked around, then assessed his own state. His wounds were already much better than they had been the day before. The burns were still rather painful, but within his capacity to endure without being slowed down in battle, too much. A couple more days of rest, and he would be close to being fully functional again. He was really hungry, though. But that was going to have to wait. Summoning the moonlight shard, Sonny gave Saint a command to follow and went to explore the obsidian tower. It took Sonny about an hour to fully explore the first level of the ancient pagoda. Some of the doors in the outer corridor had collapsed and turned to dust. Some remained standing and required him to use a tiny bit of shadow essence to unlock them. Behind the doors were all kinds of rooms. Most of them were empty, suggesting that the master of the tower had moved away a long time ago, taking all the valuable things with him, while some contained weathered debris and dust. Sonny spent a lot of time trying to understand what all these things had once been, but the damage done by the accelerated time was too extensive to even guess. Such a shame. Feeling strangely disappointed, Sonny decided that it was time to move on to other levels of the tower. He still had to find the thing that had pulled him toward this place, as well as, hopefully, some means of returning either to the chained isles or to the real world. The idea of being stuck on this island forever did not seem very appealing, especially now that there was no food anywhere around. Not finding anything interesting on the first level, Sonny decided to explore further. From the outside, it had seemed as though the obsidian tower had 6 levels, which really surprised Sonny. He had expected there to be 7. However, after finding two stairwells, one stair leading up, the other down, he realized that there was an underground level too, which explained this small discrepancy. Everything having to do with the spell and the dream realm had a tendency to be tied to the number 7, except the gods, of whom there had been only 6. I guess that's why they are called gods. No law can bind them, not even such a weird and random law as all things coming in sevens. Sonny looked up, then looked down, and decided to explore the underground level first. Letting Saint go ahead, he entered the spiraling staircase and descended into the depths of the dark island. Unlike the ground level, the basement of the obsidian tower turned out to be one giant hall. And in it, Sonny recoiled. For a second, it seemed as though hundreds of dismembered corpses were piled at the center of the hall, forming a morbid hill. But as Sonny took a step back and instinctively raised the moonlight shard, he realized that he made a mistake. The bodies piled in the center of the chamber were not that of people. Instead, they were dolls. Hundreds of broken porcelain dolls, each the size of a human, were discarded in the underground hall. Their fragile bodies were shattered and broken, laying there like abandoned toys. Some were missing limbs. Some were left with gaping holes in their torsos. Some had long ago turned into piles of small fragments, with not even their faces remaining. But those faces that did remain. Sonny tilted his head, then glanced at Saint. Every broken doll had the same face, or rather, all of their faces looked alike, as if they were all imperfect copies of the same original. They had the same flawless, inhumanly beautiful features that Saint had. Only the craftsmanship behind the faces of the broken dolls seemed much less refined, as though the sculptor had not yet perfected his skill when creating them. They all looked like Saint's lesser siblings. If Sonny ever had doubts that the obsidian tower had once belonged to a certain underworld demon, now there were none. The last child of the unknown had clearly spent some time here, was probably the one who had created the Black Pagoda in the first place, for some mysterious purpose Sonny couldn't even begin to guess. Then, however, his attention was drawn to something else. The floor of the vast hall was covered by a thick layer of dust, which should not have been disturbed in a few thousand years. But it had been. A set of fleet footprints led all the way from the bottom of the stairs, where Sonny was standing, to the pile of broken dolls, circled it, and then mysteriously disappeared. Sonny stared at it for a few moments, surprised. Someone had entered the obsidian tower before me. Sonny stared at the footprints for some more, then frowned. How does this make any sense? The obsidian tower had been sealed before he opened its gates. After he did so, the magic that had preserved everything inside was dispelled, which meant that those doors had not been opened in thousands of years. It wasn't that easy to gain entry into the pagoda, to begin with, not even mentioning the fact that one had to travel through the sky below and find the only rift in the boundless ocean of divine flames. There was also the fact that the gate had to be opened by pouring essence into the weave of diamond strings beneath its surface. Sonny could only see the weave and understand its meaning a little because his eyes had been transformed by the drop of Weaver's blood. He assumed that there were other awakened with similar abilities, but there had to be very, very few of them. And what were the chances that one would find their way to the dark island beyond the immolating sea of stars, which was hidden in the depths of this endless void? And how would they enter the pagoda without causing its seal to break? Just who was it that snuck into the obsidian tower unseen, and when? It had to have happened long before today. Sonny knew for a fact that Saint would not have let anyone come and go without waking him up. Neither would his shadows. Even when he slept, they were aware and vigilant. So it could have happened at any point in the thousands of years, since the tower had been abandoned by its rightful owner. For now, he had no answer. Feeling a little apprehensive, Sonny approached the pile of broken dolls and studied them for some time. Saint came closer, too, and stared at them silently. Then, she poked one with the tip of the midnight shard and turned away indifferently, as if losing all interest in the porcelain mannequins. I guess she doesn't care too much about lesser versions of her. Saint had repeatedly shown her disdain toward things that seemed to be replicas of her kind. It had been the same with the Black Knight, and even with the walking colossus of the Forgotten Shore. Sonny clearly remembered how unimpressed his shadow had been with the awesome stone giant. Turning away from the broken dolls, Sonny looked around and noticed that the walls of the chamber were lined with massive glass vessels. Some were whole and some were broken, but all were empty. The glass was black and opaque, covered with a thick layer of soot from the inside. A weird. Not finding anything else of interest on the underground level, he returned to where he had started and rested for a while, drinking water from the endless spring and trying to suppress his hunger. This place is so eerie. It was indeed. The Black Tower stood at the edge of an endless void of darkness, empty and abandoned, with everything inside of it made out of nothing by an inhuman mind. It was not a very welcoming place, at least not for humans. Sonny stared at the ancient walls that surrounded him and wondered about the secrets of the past. After a while, he stood up and cautiously headed for the second level of the Great Pagoda. As soon as Sonny set foot on it, though, he instantly felt that something was very, very wrong there. The feeling of deep, subtle, primordial terror he suddenly experienced was unlike anything he had known before, with the exception, perhaps, of those few moments back on the Forgotten Shore, when the walking colossus had lifted the giant three-eyed skull from the depths of the dark sea. But here this feeling was even more dire, even more invasive. What is this? Just like the underground level, this one consisted of only one great hall. The black walls rose high into the darkness, creating a magnificent and solemn atmosphere. At the center of it, cut into the obsidian floor, was a massive silver brazier, and in it, Sonny shuddered and took a step back. Something was growing from the brazier, spreading outward like a vile kind of rot. It had infected the very stone of the ancient tower, turning it into a semblance of repulsive, black, pulsating flesh. The silver brazier was infected by the terrifying growth, too, its metal somehow becoming a part of it. It seemed as if everything would become absorbed and transformed by the spreading corruption, as long as it was touched by the harrowing growth. Entire worlds would be devoured by it, perhaps, if given chance. The thing slowly spreading from the ancient brazier felt like pure evil. Sonny shivered, gave Saint a signal to stay back, and shifted his gaze slightly. He was looking past spreading black flesh at the source of this harrowing infection. At the very center of the brazier, blackened by the flames that must have raged in it once, lay a severed human arm. Well, it resembled that of a human at least. The arm was much longer than it should have been, and the hand had 7 fingers that ended with sharp claws. The rot seemed to be spreading from a terrible torn wound on the forearm to the charred and emaciated flesh, and then outward to everything else around it. Despite the repugnant state of the severed arm, the cut that separated it at the shoulder seemed clean and perfectly smooth, as if delivered by a steady and unfaltering blade. But Sonny was more affected by something else. A deep frown appeared on his face when he noticed it. In his mind's eye, the vile arm was radiating a blindingly bright, overwhelming, beautiful golden radiance. It was awash in the light of divinity. A frightening thought appeared in Sonny's head. Can it be? In front of him, stricken by the harrowing rot, was a severed arm of a deity. It was also the reason why fate had brought him to this lost and forgotten corner of the abyss. Sonny stared at the severed arm of an unknown deity, then at the harrowing, profane rot spreading from it. Then, he tiredly rubbed his face. Why can't anything ever be easy? He was sure that his fate was somehow connected to that arm, which meant that he was going to have to get to it somehow. But Sonny was also sure that there weren't enough rewards in all of the universe to make him go anywhere near that rot, let alone touch something infected by it. He had the feeling that this thing was way out of his league. In fact, he suspected that a divine being had ruthlessly severed their own arm, because even someone as powerful as that had no means to resist that spreading corruption. What was Sonny supposed to do then? Well, trying to remain as far from the rot as possible, he studied it for a while before coming to a strange conclusion, or rather, a strange question. If the corruption was so terrible, then why had it not spread through the entire tower? Why had it only managed to crawl a few meters out of the silver brazier, turning a small portion of the second level of the pagoda into its flesh? Scratch that. Why didn't the whole island become one giant chunk of rotten black, whatever the hell that thing is? The answer was not hard to guess. It was because the rot, just like everything else inside the tower, had been sealed away from time for thousands of years. And now that Sonny had broken that seal, his frown deepened as he glanced at the silver hearth that was overgrown and had become a part of the spreading rot. Now there were only two possibilities. Time was going to catch up to the devouring corruption, and it was either going to slowly consume everything or starve and die. Could that thing last for thousands of years with nothing to feed on except for cold stone? Did it need to feed on flesh and souls, or would anything do? I guess I am going to find out. Keeping an eye on the patch of harrowing rot, Sonny tried to suppress his fear and took a step forward. It didn't seem like the rot was spreading, at least not yet. In any case, he wasn't going to get closer to it. But he also knew that if the worst happened, he had no tool at his disposal that would save him. If that thing began to grow, slowly spreading across the whole of the obsidian tower, and then across the whole island, Sonny was simply going to die. Probably jump down into nothingness to avoid becoming a part of that thing. There was nowhere else to retreat to in the sky below, after all, and he doubted that he would be able to find a second secret island out there in the void. So his only hope was to find something inside the pagoda to save him. He had to explore further. Plus, there was a possibility that the rot would swiftly wither and die, not that Sonny would bet on it. Pressing his back against the cold obsidian, Sonny dismissed Saint and skirted around the outer wall of the great hall until he reached the staircase that led higher, to the third level. There, he summoned the taciturn demon again, hesitated for a bit, and then left one of his shadows to keep an eye on the devouring rot. Feeling irrational panic at the thought of turning his back to the silver brazier, Sonny gritted his teeth, and then cautiously ascended the spiraling stairs. As soon as the terrible thing disappeared from view, he let out a relieved sigh and realized that his entire body was covered in a cold sweat. Raising a trembling hand, Sonny wiped his face and then continued to climb higher. Saint being by his side gave him a little confidence, at least. The shadow seemed absolutely unperturbed by the horrific visage they had left behind. I bet fear can't even fit into that stone head of hers. Do shadows have the ability to be afraid? He didn't know whether or not Saint could feel fear, but the gloomy shadow certainly could. In fact, behind its haughty exterior, it was rather cowardly. He was sure that the bastard would have been trembling all over if not for the fact that it was currently wrapped around his body. Trying to distract himself with these thoughts, Sonny entered the third level of the obsidian tower and froze, dumbfounded by what he saw there. I see. Wait, no, what the hell am I looking at? The chamber he found himself in was smaller than the previous 3 halls he had explored, mostly because the pagoda narrowed the higher it went, but also because the level was separated into several chambers. And in that chamber in particular, dozens of porcelain's arms floated in the air, each at a different level of being disassembled into tiny parts. It was as though someone had stolen them from the pile of broken dolls in the basement of the obsidian tower, and then brought them here too. To do what, exactly? Sonny stared at the floating garden of disassembled arms, and then walked closer. He felt as though he was in some bizarre anatomy museum. As it turns out, the porcelain dolls were much more complex than he had thought. In their disassembled state, their limbs showed how intricate the design was, and how many moving parts went into making each one as functional and articulated as that of a human. The joints, in particular, seemed like a marvel of engineering, not to mention the incredibly delicate weave of the diamond string beneath. Even Spelltech automatons could not boast of that level of ingenuity and intricacy. But why were these arms brought here and taken apart? Who had done it? The prince of the underworld himself. It didn't look like it. Why would he need to study his abandoned creations? It all became clearer when Sonny reached a stone pedestal standing at the far end of the chamber, and saw a faint golden light emanating from a small object laying on it. On the surface of the table were numerous parts that had been scavenged from the disassembled porcelain arms, several skeins of beautiful diamond string, and a long, narrow needle. It was the needle that gave off a faint, weak radiance. Sonny looked at the needle, then glanced at the floating porcelain arms, nodding for the first time that each was missing a part or two. Finally, different pieces of information connected in his mind, and he felt that he understood something about what had transpired in the obsidian tower. Sometime after the prince of the underworld had left this hidden island, perhaps years, or perhaps thousands of years, an uninvited guest had snuck into the Black Pagoda like a thief, somehow getting past the closed gates without ever opening them or disturbing the seal that had been preserving this place from being ravaged by time. That thief was a divine creature themselves, and also horribly wounded. One of their arms had been torn open and infected by the spreading rot that no one, not even a deity like them, could expel. That was why the thief had severed their infected arm at the shoulder and tossed it into the divine flame that had been burning in the silver brazier on the second level, and then went down to the basement to collect limbs from the broken porcelain dolls. It was that deity that had circled the pile of them and left the footprints in the dust for Sonny to notice. In the end, the thief ascended to the third floor and fashioned a new arm for themselves from the parts of the prince's discarded mannequins, and then sewn it onto their body with the diamond strings threaded through a sharp needle. That was the needle Sonny was currently staring at, and the divine light on it was emanated by the remnant traces of the thief's blood still left on its surface. But who was the thief? And why was Sonny connected to their severed arm by a golden string of fate? Sonny hesitated for a few moments, then reached for the needle but suddenly froze. The shadow left behind to monitor the harrowing rot had noticed something. The black, ulcerous flesh was changing. Here we go. Sonny faced the stairwell and stood motionless, looking at the black rot through his trembling shadow. Sensing something, Saint turned around too. The tip of her sword hesitantly rose into the air. The next few moments were going to decide whether he was going to live or die, or maybe be condemned to a fate much worse than death. One level lower, the harrowing corruption that had been spreading from the severed arm of a deity was moving. The black ulcerous flesh was rising and falling, as if in the throes of death or transformation. Sonny gritted his teeth, waited for a second, and then breathed out with immeasurable relief. Dying, it's dying. It felt as though he had been sentenced to execution, only for a pardon to arrive at the last possible moment, when the rope was already pressing on his neck. Indeed, the terrifying rot was withering, as thousands of years that passed since it was locked in the obsidian tower caught up with it. The devouring corruption appeared to be dying of starvation. The stone surface assimilated into it, convulsed and wriggled, as if consumed by pain. The silver brazier was melting. The growths of the bulbous black flesh were slowly receding, their color turning ashen. The process was slow, but at the edges of the patch of corruption, the rot was already turning into wisps of darkness, which then disappeared without a trace. As tension left Sonny's body, he couldn't help but sway a little. Good, something has gone my way at last. Before, he had been considering his options and finding no possible way to escape from the rot if it was to start spreading. He had considered trying to damage it with broken oath, but doubted that anything the awakened memory could do would work, considering that even the original owner of the seven-fingered hand resorted to severing their limb completely instead of trying to destroy the spreading corruption. He had also entertained the idea of using the cruel sight, which was now infused with divine flame. But something told Sonny that the massive brazier where the rot had taken root had once been full of it. Too, that was apparent from how charred the severed arm of the transient deity was. If even thousands of years of burning in annihilating divine flame couldn't destroy or stop the black rot, then what hope did he have? In the end, though, the corruption had destroyed itself. Neither divine flame nor an actual deity had been able to damage the black rot, but its hunger and the relentless nature of time were. Thank gods. Sonny inhaled deeply and tiredly closed his eyes. The corruption was slowly dying, pieces of it slowly disappearing, bit after bit. All that was left behind were the damaged stone and the memory of primal horror. He grimaced. But also, damn the gods, why would they allow for such a thing to exist? Shaking his head, Sonny wiped the sweat off his face, then turned around and walked back to the stone pedestal. Reaching with one hand, he picked up the long, sharp needle and stared at it for some time. The needle seemed to have been made out of polished iron, but due to the traces of divine blood absorbed by it, the cold metal had assumed a faint golden shine. Sonny looked at it for a long time, trying to understand if this was a mundane item or some mystical artifact. In the end, he had to admit that he had no clue. The needle did not turn into a memory like Weaver's mask had. He didn't see any spellweave inside of it either. However, the needle also didn't feel like a simple object. It was strange. He thought for a bit, then summoned the covetous coffer and carefully placed the needle inside. The skeins of diamond string also went in, easily disappearing into the gluttonous box. I will have time to study it later. With that, Sonny hesitated for a bit, then reluctantly headed back toward the second level of the great pagoda. He was going to watch the harrowing rot die, and then try to approach the severed hand of the mysterious deity. Some time later, Sonny was sitting on the lowest step of the stairs leading to the great hall, staring at the massive brazier in its center. What was left of it, to be precise. The devouring corruption took its sweet time dying. Even the hunger of thousands of years could not destroy it so easily, it seemed. The black flesh writhed and pulsated, disappearing little by little. Several times, veins of rot tried to spread outward, clearly sensing the presence of a living being nearby and lusting to absorb it, him. But the profane infestation was too weak to overcome the entropic power of starvation. The silver brazier, which had long ago become a part of the horrid corruption, melted and fell apart, then disappeared into wisps of pure darkness. Soon, it was clear that the rot was not long for this world. All that remained from its vile flesh were a few growths infused into the severed arm itself. Staring at the disintegrating rot, Sonny felt both deep, primal terror and a strange compulsion to try and damage it, a little in hopes of being credited for the kill by the spell. Who knew what reward he would receive? But in the end, Sonny remained still. Firstly, because he wasn't even sure that the corruption would be acknowledged by the spell as a creature. He didn't really know if that thing was alive, for the lack of a better word. If it was an entity, a process, or a manifestation of some profane law that he didn't know of. Secondly, because he was absolutely unwilling to approach the rot, even now that it was dying. He wasn't even willing to let his memories get anywhere near it. The memories were connected to his soul, after all. Who knew if that thing was capable of spreading to a memory, and then to his very soul through the invisible link? So Sonny simply sat silently and waited. After a while, the corruption finally died. The charred flesh of the severed arm became ashen, crumbled into dust, and finally disappeared in wisps of deep, impenetrable darkness. All that remained was the empty hall, the patch of mangled obsidian in its center, a single piece of pristine alabaster bone shining with blinding gold radiance. A sole phalanx of a finger. Sonny waited for a few minutes, gathering his courage, then sighed and stood up. He glanced at the small bone, scowled, and walked toward it. It was time to see what fate had in store for him. Sonny stepped into the patch of mangled obsidian and slowly approached the alabaster phalanx, then kneeled beside it and lingered, studying its golden shine. He was trying to determine if any sign of the harrowing rot remained, but also felt pulled toward the radiant bone and found it hard to look away. All of this insanity just for that little piece of bone. What secrets does it hold? He hesitated for a moment, then reached down and picked up the phalanx. Sonny had instinctively expected it to crumble into a torrent of white sparks, and hear the spell proclaim that he had acquired a new memory, just like what had happened with Weaver's mask, that memory being, perhaps, another drop of ichor. But nothing of the sort happened. The bone felt cold and smooth to the touch. There was still marrow inside, wet and infused with bright golden radiance. Sonny tilted his head, stumped. What was he supposed to do now? In hindsight, the fact that the phalanx was not going to turn into a memory was rather sensible, obvious, even. After all, memories were simply copies of real items recreated by the spell, just like echoes were copies of actual creatures, or items conjured by it from scratch following some unknown principle. This was the real deal. The alabaster bone had nothing to do with the spell. It wasn't a recreation, it was the original. Sonny frowned, feeling unsure about how he was supposed to proceed. Then a certain scene suddenly appeared in his mind. Back in the ruined cathedral of the Dark City, Saint stood above the rusted remains of the Black Knight, holding a black gem in her hand. With a hint of some dark emotion burning in her ruby eyes, she raised the gem to her mouth and bit into it. Before he could fully process the implications of this image, Sonny followed a strange instinct. Without allowing himself time to think about it, he opened his mouth, put the phalanx inside, and swallowed it. What? He blinked a couple of times. What did I just do? Sonny stared at his empty hand, in which a divine bone had been just a few seconds ago, with wide eyes. And then it was as though a furious fire ignited in his chest. Grab! Sonny tumbled to the floor, feeling a harrowing pain permeate his entire being. It was the unbearable agony he knew and remembered all too well, the feeling of his very nature being forcibly changed into something that it was never meant to be, that nothing was ever meant to be, or maybe simply not allowed to. It was the opposite of the euphoric sense of rebirth the awakened experienced after completing the first nightmare or returning from the dream realm for the first time. The feeling of your whole body being torn apart and reassembled, only to be torn apart once more. Arg, here we go again. The torturous suffering he was experiencing was very similar to what he had gone through after consuming the drop of Weaver's blood. Back then, it had felt as though every muscle, every fiber, every molecule in his body were destroyed and recreated over and over again, becoming slightly different with each time. The agony had been especially excruciating when it came to his eyes, which had felt as though two white-hot rods were inserted into them. This time was different. The pain was concentrated in his spine, in his bones, in the marrow permeating them. His fingers in particular felt as though there was molten, incandescent, liquid metal flowing through them. Sonny shrieked, "Damn it, God damn it all. It hurt so much." However, the torture did not last as long as it had back in the branches of the soul-devouring tree. After a few more minutes of it, Sonny felt the blood weave suddenly come alive and rush through his veins, absorbing the harrowing heat and then carrying it to every cell of his body. Slowly but surely, the pain lessened. But the process of transformation continued. Sonny sprawled on the floor, covered in sweat and breathing heavily. He could feel himself changing. It was a strange and extremely unpleasant sensation, one suffused with a feeling of profound wrongness, but not as devastatingly excruciating as it had been just a few seconds ago. Hell, that was rough. His voice was hoarse and creaky. Sonny glanced to the side and noticed Saint, who was standing silently above him and looking away with cold indifference. Such heartlessness, no sympathy at all. At least the happy shadow seemed very concerned about him or itself. It was packing nervously, turning to Sonny from time to time and timidly offering its encouragement. The gloomy shadow was currently wrapped around his body, so it couldn't offer any feedback. He had no doubt that it would have just mocked him anyway. That jolly guy is really irritating. I would rather be mocked, curse it all. Gritting his teeth, Sonny closed his eyes and endured the unpleasant feeling of his body being demolished and reconstructed as best as he could. After a long while, which felt like an eternity, it was all finally over. A deep feeling of relief spread through Sonny's body. It felt more solid somehow, strong, firm, resilient. Just what have I? The voice of the spell suddenly thundered in the solemn dark hall, interrupting his thoughts. Was he imagining it, or had there been a note of dark excitement in it? It said, "One of your attributes has evolved. You have acquired a new attribute." You don't say. Sonny struggled to sit up, and then hurriedly summoned the runes. What have I done to myself this time? The runes shimmered in the air in front of him, and Sonny quickly looked at the cluster describing his attributes. Attributes faded, Ember of Divinity. Wait, Ember. This was new. He concentrated on the Ember of Divinity and studied the string of runes. Attribute description. Deep within your soul, an ember of divinity shines, almost ready to erupt into a radiant flame. So I have an even higher affinity to divinity now. Makes sense. He had just swallowed a phalanx of an actual deity, after all. Impatient, Sonny turned back to the list of attributes, where 3 more remained. The first 2 he knew all too well. Child of Shadows, Blood Weave. But the third one was new. At the very end of the list, several new runes appeared. Sonny held his breath and read. Attribute Bone Weave, Bone Weave. Sonny let the sound of it echo in his mind, overwhelmed by a feeling of savage joy. He didn't know what that attribute gifted him yet, but was certain that it would be something special. The Blood Weave had saved his life so many times after all. And after his encounter with the mordant mimic, he learned that having strong bones was as important as having tenacious blood. Shifting his gaze away from the runes, he stared at one of his hands, then made a fist. This was the arm that had been shattered by the vile creature, and then slowly healed while he was falling into the sky below. Even though Sonny had already been able to use it for the past few days, it used to feel weak, awkward, and slightly damaged. But now it was as good as new. More than that, actually, it was better than ever before. All of his bones felt much more durable and resilient, stronger. His joints seemed to be slightly more agile too. His teeth felt as though they could crush stones and cut through metal. The strangest change, however, happened to his fingers. It wasn't very apparent, though. On the surface, it simply felt as though they had grown subtly more sensitive, the tactile feeling of touching things becoming deeper and richer. However, Sonny suspected that the true change was more profound. He just didn't know what it was exactly. Blood Weave had altered his eyes in a very fundamental way, so Bone Weave had to have a lot of promise. He ran his fingers across the soft surface of the puppeteer's shroud, vividly feeling the silken fabric slide against his skin. A neat. Then Sonny stretched his limbs, sensing their newfound agility. He was already weirdly limber due to practicing shadow dance, which demanded the utmost level of pliability from the practitioner's body. Now, however, it was even further enhanced. Satisfied, Sonny turned back to the runes and read. Attribute Bone Weave. Attribute description. You have inherited a part of Weaver's forbidden lineage. Your bones have been altered and imbued with steadfast temperance. He tilted his head, stunned by the somewhat expected, but still profoundly fascinating piece of information he just received. Weaver's legacy. So the severed arm had actually belonged to the mysterious demon of fate. It was Weaver who had snuck into their siblings' tower while bearing a terrible wound, sliced off their rotting limb, and then fashioned a new one from the parts scavenged from the broken porcelain dolls before sewing it onto their body with diamond strings. It was Weaver's footprints that Sonny had seen in the basement of the great obsidian pagoda. He trembled. Even though Sonny had seen many incredible things and lived through many unlikely events, both wondrous and terrifying, he suddenly felt awe. It was as though he was suddenly in the presence of divinity. Demon of Fate had been to this dark island, had walked the same halls that Sonny walked, and breathed the same air. The sharp needle infused with remnant traces of their blood was currently inside his storage memory, as well as the diamond string they had used to sew a new arm to their body. Unlike the miraculous black mask, the needle was not a memory either. It was the actual thing. But most of all, Sonny had swallowed a phalanx bone of the divine being in question. Crazy, this is crazy. He blinked a few times, then suddenly thought. Was this how Neff felt when she first met Kai, I wonder? What a random and ridiculous thought. Then a slight frown appeared on his face. Why would Weaver secretly come to their younger brother's abandoned workshop? What was the harrowing rot that had been spreading from their wound, and what manner of creature could have wounded them so terribly? What could even damage a deity? Sonny had so many questions. Luckily, the description of the Bone Weave was not over. Several strings of runes still remained. He concentrated and read. When children of the unknown rebelled against the gods, Weaver was the only one to refuse the call of war. Despised and hunted by both sides, they disappeared. No one knew where Weaver went and what they did, until it was too late. Sonny shivered. A few things became more clear from this short description. Firstly, it cemented his suspicion that, at some point in time, the 7 demons children of the mysterious unknown, who were also strangely described as having created themselves, had waged war against the gods. Or rather, 6 of them, since Weaver apparently decided to not join either side in this conflict. Secondly, Weaver's reluctance to participate in the war had landed them in big trouble with both the gods and the other demons. Unsurprisingly, one side would have seen the demon of fate as one of the enemies simply by virtue of them being a demon, while the other would have seen them as a traitor, for that same reason. That could potentially explain how Weaver ended up being ghastly wounded, and why they had to sneak into the obsidian tower in secret. These 2 pieces of information were extremely fascinating, but it was the third one that gave Sonny pause. No one knew what Weaver did until it was too late. That sounded so ominous. That made it seem as though Weaver alone had turned out to be more terrible than both the 6 demons and the 6 gods combined, in the end. What exactly had Weaver done? Sonny really wanted to know the answer to this question, and not only out of idle curiosity. He was carrying 2 parts of Weaver's lineage inside of him now, after all. The lineage that was described as being forbidden. Was the reason for that connected to what Weaver had done? Just as always, the answers Sonny had received brought him a swarm of new questions. Curses. With a sigh, he dismissed the runes and stood up. There was no sense in pondering about that now, not without finding more information, both about the demons and the gods. After all that had transpired, he was incredibly tired and hungry. But mostly hungry. With a resentful sigh, Sonny gave Saint a sign to follow and headed back toward the first level. Several days later, Sonny was sitting on a piece of broken furniture in the central hall of the first level of the obsidian tower. The covetous coffer stood near him, its lid open and its sharp teeth revealed. He was holding the cruel sight in his hand. The silver blade of the somber spear was incandescent with white radiance, infused with divine flame. Sonny was currently using said divine flame to roast a piece of repulsive, slightly rotten black meat. That was the last piece of mimic's flesh he had stored inside the coffer before taking a plunge into the ocean of merciless stars. Saint was also nearby, staring into the distance with her usual cold indifference. He glanced at her, then sighed. "Sorry that I haven't fed you in a while." The shadow did not react to his words in any sort of way. Sonny continued to talk, though, unbothered by the taciturn demon's apparent lack of interest. "Hey, that's not true. It is not my fault. Blame my incredible luck instead. What can I do? The memories I find are just too incredible. How can I let you eat them? I can't." He grinned, then threw a dubious look at the sizzling black meat and sighed. "I guess it's done." Dismissing the cruel sight, Sonny brought the meat to his mouth and took a bite out of it. As he chewed, an absolutely miserable expression appeared on his face. "Ah, that's the stuff. I tell you, Saint, this meat can easily be described as absolutely delicious. Simply to die for, even. I pity you really for being unable to taste. Oh, damn it, how can anything be so vile? My delicious cooking. It's the best mimic steak you can possibly eat in a lifetime. Just a single bite can really change your life. For the worst." At least chewing the damned thing was much easier now. Before the acquisition of bone weave, eating mimic's meat felt like gnawing on an old leather boot. It felt pretty much the same now, but Sonny's teeth were different. They were able to slice and cut through the tough meat of the devil with ease. Plus, it wasn't raw. That was already a reason to celebrate. Feeling his eyes tearing up from disgust, Sonny glanced at Saint and forced the smile to remain on his face. "Are you left speechless by my culinary skill? Fair, fair." However, in the next moment, a voice suddenly resounded in the darkness of the obsidian tower. "You actually survived." Sonny choked on a piece of the vile meat. For a second, he thought that his loyal shadow had only been pretending to be mute all this time, instead simply choosing not to speak to him. But no, he recognized the voice. Sadly, it wasn't Saint. It was Mordred, the Prince of Nothing, was back. Thank gods. Sonny had been burdened by being all alone on the dark island much more than he was willing to admit. Even though he didn't trust the mysterious voice, he felt relieved to hear it. Swallowing the meat, he took a sip from the endless spring, then looked around the hall and said, "As you can see, although being the honest to a fault young man that I am, I have to admit that it wasn't easy or pleasant. In fact, I can hardly believe that I survived myself." He glanced at his body, which was still in a rather sorry state. His burns were healing, but much slower than they would have usually healed. Even though the divine flame had not touched him directly, just the heat radiated by it was enough to leave long-lasting traces that even blood weave wasn't able to remove fast. Mordred remained silent before speaking again, as he usually did. When his voice appeared, it was full of genuine surprise. "You really found the rift in the ocean of flames." Sonny shrugged. "As it turned out, I was more or less falling toward it the whole time. But even then, I almost burned to death trying to reach it. My most powerful memories were heavily damaged, and I only survived thanks to a bit of luck. Which was technically true, although not nearly all of the truth. The mysterious prince hesitated, then asked, "Where are you now?" Sonny tilted his head. How much of my surroundings can he perceive, I wonder? The first thing that Mordred had ever said to him was ask why it was so dark, so he probably could see something, at least. "Can't you see where I am?" The voice answered, most likely honestly. "I can see a big hall filled with ancient, broken things. That doesn't tell me a lot, though." "Makes sense." Sonny nodded, feeling the pressure of the flaw building up in his soul, demanding for him to deliver an answer. He gestured at the interior of the obsidian tower. "Well, beyond the false stars, the void continues for who knows how much further down. But some distance from the flames, there is actually a single island floating in the emptiness. There is a magnificent black pagoda on that island, which looks like the exact copy of the ivory tower. That is where I am right now, inside that pagoda." Then Sonny scratched the back of his head and added, "But anyway, how come I can still hear you? Haven't you told me that your voice would not reach beyond the stars?" Mordred sighed. "That was what I thought. Luckily, I seem to have been wrong." After a short pause, he said in a strange tone, "The Ebony Tower, so it does exist." Sonny blinked. "I guess it's one way to call it." Then, however, a complicated expression appeared on his face. "Wait, you knew about it." The mysterious prince remained silent for a bit, then answered, "That is what I had been trying to find before I couldn't search anymore. There were some hints that a duplicate of the ivory tower exists somewhere in the sky below. I hope to reach it." Sonny chose his next words cautiously. "Oh, really? What else do you know about that place?" Mordred thought for a few moments, then answered wistfully. "It is said that a very powerful being came to this shattered land after it had been destroyed by the Lord of Light. Back then, the sky below was not as boundless, and there were much more fragments of divine flame still burning in its empty darkness. That being wanted to harvest those flames." Suddenly, a lot of small details about the dark island and the obsidian tower became much clearer. Sonny already had suspicions about the true purpose of this place, but now they were confirmed. The ruined machines outside the pagoda, the blackened worktable, the massive glass vessels covered with soot from the inside, the silver brazier. The prince of the underworld had not truly lived in the magnificent pagoda. It was not his home, just a station he had built in the ocean of flame, which had been much larger back then, to harvest some of the divine fire. Why he had need of it, Sonny did not know. But he suspected that the prideful demon had either succeeded in his purpose or failed, and that was why he eventually left and sealed the obsidian tower, which then stood abandoned for thousands of years. And at some point during that time, another child of the had come here for a short while, although their purpose was very different. This revelation came and went. There was a question burning in his mind that had nothing to do with such distant past instead. It was much more pressing. Sonny swallowed another piece of meat and asked casually, "Harvest divine flames, very interesting. Was that why you wanted to come here too? Or had Mordred been after something else?" "Was after something else." The Lost Prince laughed. "No, not really. In fact, I wasn't that interested in the Ebony Tower itself, to begin with." Sonny frowned. "Why did you want to find it if you weren't interested in it?" Mordred sighed. After a long pause, he answered, his voice dark and full of suppressed emotion. "What I was interested in was not the copy, but the original, the ivory tower. The two are supposed to be connected somehow. If one finds that connection, they might just be able to reach past the crushing and step foot on the heavenly isle." Sonny remained silent for a while, thinking feverishly. A bridge between the two towers. That was his chance to escape this dismal place and return to the real world. The problem was, He had no clue what this connection Mordred had told him about was. However, he had an idea. In the past several days, Sonny had explored the rest of the obsidian, of the ebony tower. He had made a couple of fascinating discoveries, but most of it was now full of nothing except dust and rubble. Pretty much everything inside the pagoda disintegrated due to the onslaught of time after he had opened its gates. The most promising and mysterious of his finds, though, was situated on the last level of the tower, in a small circular hall that housed nothing except for a graceful stone arch, which stood lonesomely in its center and looked like a misplaced, empty doorframe. The most intriguing part about the arch was that it was surrounded by a circle of runes, almost like the gateway in the Crimson Spire had been. In fact, that was what Sonny assumed it to be, an inactive gateway. For that reason, he had spent these days trying to find a way to activate it. He had poured shadow essence into the arch itself, as well as every corner of the hall. He had studied the unfamiliar runes, hoping to either find a way to translate them or maybe discover a place where they had been damaged, thus rendering the arch useless. But nothing had worked yet. The information provided by Mordred instantly changed his perception of the arch, though. If what the Lost Prince had told him was true, then maybe it wasn't a gateway to the real world. Maybe it was an entrance to the magical bridge connecting the ebony tower to its ivory counterpart. Still, how was he supposed to make the damn thing work? With a deep scowl appearing on his face, Sonny asked, "If this place is really connected to the ivory tower, then how would one go about using that connection? Do you have any ideas? There is something that looks like a portal here, but it doesn't work. I tried to open it 100 times to no avail." Mordred thought for a bit, then said uncertainly, "Have you tried saturating it with essence?" Sonny grimaced. "Of course, what am I, a fool? That was the first thing I attempted." He hesitated for a few moments, then voiced something that had been keeping him worried for a while. Maybe it requires some sort of a key to be opened." The voice remained silent for a long time. Then Mordred said, "No, I don't think so." Sonny raised an eyebrow. "Really, why?" The Lost Prince answered casually, "Because only doors that can be kicked open require locks and keys. The master of this place wasn't someone who needed such things to keep uninvited guests away." Makes sense, I guess. He seems to know a lot about the prince of the underworld, though. I thought knowledge of demons was really scarce." Sonny sighed. "So how do I activate the connection then?" Mordred considered the question for a second or two, then said with a hint of doubt in his voice, "The creator of the Ebony Tower was a builder of things, a genius artifacts, but also of practical sort from what little knowledge of him remains. He would have probably used whatever was at hand and went for the simplest solution. Builders don't like overcomplicated things after all." Sonny considered his words. The simplest solution. A seed of an idea appeared in his mind. With a thoughtful expression, he took another bite out of the piece of meat and chewed it thoroughly. The Lost Prince politely remained silent while Sonny ate. After a while, however, he suddenly spoke. "Oh, by the way, I don't want to worry you, Sunless, but there seems to be a powerful nightmare creature standing right behind you." Sonny almost choked again. If not for the fact that he was looking both forward and back at the same time with the help of the shadows, he would have jumped and summoned the cruel sight immediately. But he knew that there was no one behind him, except for Saint. He swallowed the foul meat, then smiled weakly. "Curses, you almost gave me a heart attack. That's not a nightmare creature. Can't you differentiate a real demon from an echo?" Mordred remained silent for a bit, then said with amusement, "She is your echo, fascinating." Sonny frowned. "What's so fascinating about it?" However, there was no answer. The mysterious prince was gone once again, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. Usually, Sonny was irritated by this annoying habit of his, but this time he was glad. Sonny couldn't wait to go back to the 6th level, but didn't want Mordred to see what he had found on the level before. He still didn't trust the Lost Prince, even though Mordred had been nothing but helpful up until now. Extremely so, in fact. Sonny didn't know if he would have even been alive without his guidance. Later, if I manage to return to the sanctuary in one piece, I'll start trusting him then. A little, maybe. Finishing up his meal, the last he was going to have in a while, Sonny stood up, stretched, and headed toward the stairs. After he had received the bone weave and rested, Sonny explored the rest of the 3rd level of the Ebony Tower. However, he had not found anything of note there. He also had not discovered any more traces left behind by Weaver, which disappointed him a great deal. The 4th level, however, was much more interesting. The central hall of it was fashioned into a vast, somber shrine. At the center of it stood an altar cut from a single slab of black onyx, and behind it was an incredibly beautiful statue of a young woman dressed in a flowing tunic, her face obscured by a veil. The young woman was holding a star in one hand and a bolt of lightning in the other. Sonny was pretty sure that she was none other than Storm God, also known as the goddess of black skis, deity of the oceans, of the depths, darkness, stars, travel, guidance, and disaster. Which was really interesting. Why would the prince of the underworld build a shrine to his sworn enemy at the very heart of the Ebony Tower? Their relationship, it seemed, was not as simple as Sonny had thought. He had been much more interested in the altar itself, though. After finding the shrine, Sonny had tried to place magical coins on the onyx surface and even spilled a bit of his blood on it. But this time, the gods had not answered. The coins, too, simply remained laying on the altar instead of turning into shadow essence. It seemed that the altar was not mystical at all. In fact, as far as altars went, this one appeared to be quite mundane. Sonny had quickly lost interest and continued exploring the great pagoda. And he had not been disappointed by that decision. Because there was something very, very important on the 5th level of the Ebony Tower. The 5th level of the Ebony Tower had almost killed Sonny. It was completely empty, its black walls drowning in darkness and unadorned. There was no dust, no ruined pieces of furniture, tools, or strange metal devices, not even lanterns. There were, however, countless runes carved into the walls themselves, and almost all of those runes were of the kind that radiated a sickening, dire sensation that made one feel as though their mind was breaking apart. The same mysterious runes that the spell used to describe the unknown, and that Sonny had seen written on the floor by the prisoner of the small cell that was hidden under the ruined cathedral in the dark city. Back then, looking at them dealt a heavy blow to Sonny, but he persisted and was eventually able to read a single phrase that the prisoner had written, unlike everything else, in a familiar script. "Hail Weaver, demon of fate, firstborn of the..." On the second to last level of the Ebony Tower, however, there were much more of the terrible runes, and most of them seemed far more intense, far more powerful. When Sonny had first set foot into the dark hall, he yelped and jumped back, then rolled down the spiraling stairs all the way back to the shrine of the storm god. Good thing his bones were now much more hardy. Eventually, however, he had returned to the Hall of Runes. Sonny knew that looking at the vile writings could destroy his sanity, maybe even outright kill him, so he had done so with his eyes closed and while leaving the shadows behind, so that they, too, could not see the ancient walls. Even then, he felt a terrible pressure constantly assaulting his mind. He was not going to leave without learning at least something from this chamber of secrets. Where else would he ever be able to study writing left behind by an actual demon? So he tried to limit the scope of what he saw and glance at the obsidian walls, one little section at a time. The experience was nothing short of horrid, but at least tolerable. And only when Sonny summoned Weaver's mask was he able to look at the portions of the hall without feeling like passing out or falling down in a fit of convulsions. The forbidden runes turned less dreadful but did not give up their secrets. He didn't know their language after all. The spell, too, either refused or failed to translate them. His exploration, however, was not for naught, because, while slowly moving around the dark hall, he discovered something extremely valuable. It was a map, or rather, a strange semblance of one. Both the runes and the images constituting the map were cut into the stone, their lines smooth and deep. Sonny did not know what tool the prince of the underworld had wielded to leave these markings behind, but imagined him simply using his nail to cut into the indestructible stone that even divine fire couldn't destroy. At the center of the map, jagged mountains were depicted, shrouded by mist. Directly south of them, an island with a familiar silhouette of a graceful pagoda floated above flames. Even further south, separated from the mountains by a vast emptiness, was a mighty castle. Far to the west, a snowy peak stood near a fuming volcano, and nestled between them was an arched bridge. To the southwest, a strange ship floated on ghostly waves. Southeast of the mountains, divided from them by a long stretch of nothingness, a perfectly symmetrical pyramid was cut into the obsidian wall. And lastly, to the north, further away than any other image above all of them, was a familiar shape. A fearsome mask stared at Sonny, crowned with 3 horns. Weaver's mask. The map was strange, however, because the areas it depicted seemed disconnected somehow. There were no borders, no terrain, no measure of distance between them. The ideas of north, south, east, and west were only something Sonny had assigned to the map out of habit. Truly, it could have been the exact opposite, or impossible to apply to the logic of the map altogether. But at the same time, it fit with the geography of the dream realm as he knew it, somewhat. Each of the images had an inscription near them, written in a runic language that Sonny had trouble understanding. It was similar to the one used by the spell, but also different enough to make translation either impossible or difficult. But even without reading the inscriptions, he easily guessed what the images meant. The mountains depicted in the center of the map were, of course, the Hollow Mountains. Even if the image itself was only familiar, their closeness to the ivory tower cemented that conclusion. The ivory tower, of course, represented the Chained Isles. The castle to the south had to be Bastion. Although Sonny had never seen it with his own 2 eyes, he knew its silhouette and appearance from childhood, just like any other human in the real world. Its likeness was the stage for countless dramas, movies, and webtoons, after all. Similarly, he recognized the great stone bridge nestled between a snowy peak and a raging volcano. It was the road to Ravenheart, the great citadel ruled by Clan Song. Knowing the position of Bastion and Ravenheart, it wasn't hard to surmise that the ship sailing on the ghostly waves represented the Storm Sea, where the citadel of the 3rd great clan, House of Night, was located. Sonny had no idea what the pyramid to the east represented. The 7th image, however, was rather clear. It meant Weaver. By knowing who it described, he was also able to translate the inscription near the depiction of the mask. It read, Fate. There was another symbol near it, though, which meant something akin to a question mark, an inquiry. So actually, it was fate. Basically, even the prince of the underworld had no idea where his eldest sibling lived. And this was what the images were, in Sonny's mind. They represented the 7 demons, or rather, their domains, which was nothing short of tantalizing in and of itself, but also meant several things. Firstly, that the 3 great clans had inherited their citadels from 3 demons, or at least built their strongholds in the regions of the dream realm where demons had once dwelt. Secondly, that the underworld most likely was situated beneath the Hollow Mountains. This death zone was the very dark and cavernous domain to which the prince of the underworld had retreated after his conflict with the goddess of the black skis. And lastly, that the ruler of the beautiful and prosperous land that had invoked the wrath of Sun God and doomed their kingdom to destruction, and eventual transformation into the Chained Isles, was a demon as well. Coincidentally, the inscription cut into the stone near the image of the ivory tower was the only one after that of Weavers that Sunny was able to translate, since the runes closely resembled those usually used by the spell. It was desire. The other meaning of the runes, however, was hope. The ivory tower had once belonged to the demon of hope. That revelation had given Sunny a lot to think about. The demon of hope or desire, a demon whose power was most likely tied to souls and mind. What act could such a being have committed to cause Sun God to destroy their whole domain? And what had happened to that being after? Just as usual, there were no answers. Sunny was slowly learning more and more, though. For now, the pieces of information he had earned were scattered and disconnected. But if he continued to slowly accumulate knowledge, one day they were going to start clicking together. And then, what terrible and wondrous truths would he uncover? Enough to make up for a lifetime of lies, perhaps. Apart from inscriptions dedicated to Weaver and the ivory tower, Sunny failed to translate anything else. He had, however, memorized every little detail of the unfamiliar runes describing the Hollow Mountains, Bastion, Ravenheart, a ship sailing on the storm sea, and the mysterious pyramid to the east. I'll have to visit Teacher Julius when I'm back in the real world. He has to know something about this script, right? Thinking about the map, Sunny entered the rune hall, kept his eyes closed, and walked to the entrance to the stairwell leading to the 6th level of the Ebony Tower. The last one. When he entered the chamber of the stone arch, he sighed with relief. The pressure emanated by the terrifying runes was finally gone, leaving his mind at ease. The headache caused by them, however, was going to persist for a few more minutes. Sunny sat down, leaned his back against the wall, and stared at the arch while waiting to fully recover. The highest level of the Great Pagoda was not very large in comparison to the 6 others. It was just one big hall, circular in shape, and almost completely empty. The only thing inside of it was the arch itself. It was tall and composed of the same material as the rest of the Ebony Tower. In fact, the arch didn't seem to have been built. Instead, it was almost as if it had simply grown out of the floor, without any seams separating it from the black stone. It looked like a doorway that someone had put in the middle of the chamber for some reason, and then forgot to attach a door to it. This was Sunny's only hope of escape. He stared at it for a long time, thinking about how to make the portal work. In the past, he had tried a lot of things to activate the arch, as well as studying the circle of runes surrounding it, but nothing he had done accomplished anything. His recent conversation with Mordred, however, had given Sunny an idea. What had Mordred said? That the prince of the underworld was somewhat of a divine smith, a builder of things, but also of the practical sort, that he would have used whatever was at hand, going for the simplest solution. That more or less confirmed what Sunny knew of the prideful demon already. After all, Saint and her kin had been created by the prince of the underworld. In retrospect, Sunny had completely failed to understand the magnitude of that accomplishment. To create a living being from nothing, a whole race of them, really. That did sound like something that only a god would be able to do, didn't it? The prince of the underworld, however, was not a god. He was a demon, a lesser deity. Was the creation of Saint and her people his way of showing the true divinities that he was in no way inferior to them? Or was he guided by some different ambition? I wonder how the gods reacted. Teacher Julius had described demons as terrible beings that inspired fear because of their unknown origins and strange powers. What happened after one of them had accomplished something that was supposed to be in the purview of only the gods? Saint's description, back when she was an echo, said that she and her kin were designed to bring peace, but were born into an endless war instead. Huh. But regardless, that was not the point. The point was that Saint was made out of stone. Sunny had always thought that it was an integral part of her design, a fundamental aspect of the vision her creator had for the living statues, to make them stronger perhaps or harder to destroy. But after witnessing the porcelain dolls and speaking with Mordred, Sunny was not so sure anymore. The broken dolls showed that the material from which to make his creations had not mattered to the prince of the underworld too much. What was at hand the simplest solution? Was Saint made out of stone, simply because there was a lot of stone in the hollow mountains for its prince to use in his experiments? There was nothing but stone there, really. That can't be right, can it? But somehow, Sunny felt that it was indeed right. He glanced at Saint and blinked a couple of times. A lazy bastard. Sunny shivered, half expecting to be struck down for thinking about the mighty demon in such unflattering terms. When nothing happened, he shook his head and returned to his thoughts. There was plenty of stone in the hollow mountains, but there was literally nothing around the ebony tower. But what about in the past? What had there been a lot of around it back at the time the prince of the underworld resided in the sky below? What would he have used to power his magical engines? This pagoda had been built to harvest divine flames, after all. Feeling the headache finally retreat, Sunny stood up and walked over to the arch. Then, he summoned the cruel sight, activated the dark mirror enchantment, and poured his essence into it. Watching the silver blade become infused with incandescent white light. Then, he hesitated for a moment, and lightly pressed the tip of the somber spear against the cold black stone. Immediately, it was as though the floodgates had been opened in his soul. The shadow essence flowed into the cruel sight, and through it, the divine flame flowed into the arch. Sunny staggered. In just a few seconds, all of his essence was spent. However, the portal did not open. Something in the hall did change, though. The circle of runes surrounding the obsidian arch began to glow with weak, shimmering light. That light was dim and barely visible, but it was, without a doubt, there. Sunny stared at the runes for a long time, and then a wide grin appeared on his face. Bingo! For the next few days, Sunny's life became rather monotonous. He would meditate while circulating the shadow essence through the coils of the soul serpent to enhance the speed of its recovery, pour it into the obsidian arch, and repeat the process. With each cycle, the runes surrounding the portal became brighter and brighter. The portal was slowly coming to life, filling Sunny with hope so intense that he struggled to contain it. He had no doubt that he would be able to activate the arch. And then he would go to the ivory tower, find a way to descend back to the chained aisles, somehow, and return to the real world. And buy a new refrigerator. And stock it with all kinds of food. Sitting on the stone floor of the highest level of the ebony tower, Sunny looked at the covetous coffer which stood nearby with a resentful expression. He knew full well that there was no meat left there, or any other kind of food. Who knew he would miss the vile flesh of the mordant mimic one day? I guess one should never say never. Sunny was close to fully replenishing the shadow essence, so his thoughts began to wander. Out of boredom, he dove into the soul sea, stared at the shadows for some time, then paced around, then summoned some of his memories and read their descriptions for the 100th time, then stared at the looming black suns of his shadow cores, then paced some more, then summoned a few other memories. Boring, so boring. After a while, something finally attracted his attention. The runes of Weaver's mask had apparently changed a little. Before there was in place of the name of its third enchantment. After Sunny had activated that enchantment, almost frying his brain in the process, the name changed, however. He blinked a few times, then looked at the runes again. Did I read it right? But no, there was no mistake. The first two enchantments were just as before, Mantle of Lies and Simple Trick. The third one, however, now had new runes describing it. Memory Enchantment, Where is my eye? Where is my eye? Enchantment description. Helps the wielder peer into the tapestry of fate. Sunny looked at the runes with a deadpan expression for a few moments, and then laughed so hard that it threw him out of the soul sea. Oh gods, where is my eye? Priceless. By the time he was done laughing at Weaver's strange numbing sensibility, the cycle of restoring the shadow essence was complete. Sunny shook his head, smiled, then stood up and summoned the cruel sight. By now, the circle of runes was burning with a furious white radiance, turning the somber black hall into a stark tapestry of darkness and light. It seemed as if the air inside the arch was rippling slightly, hazy from heat. He walked toward the obsidian arch and, without wasting any time, touched it with the tip of the silver spear. Once again, his soul essence was devoured at terrible speed. This time, however, only half of it was consumed. As bright light suddenly hit Sunny in the eyes, he took an involuntary step back and raised a hand to shield them. A cool breeze caressed his face, and he could suddenly smell bark, grass, soil. Life. When his eyes adjusted to the brightness, Sunny slowly lowered his hand and looked at the arch with a bewildered expression. It was as though a rift in reality appeared inside the ebony tower. All around the portal, the hall was just as it had been, dark, somber, cut from lusterless black stone. Inside the portal, however, was a clear blue sky. Sunlight had suddenly invaded the ebony tower after thousands of years spent in utter darkness, and brought with it the sounds of the wind and the rustling of leaves. Sunny could see the skis, but also the ground. A beautiful green meadow continued from where the obsidian floor ended, full of vibrancy and life. A shadow of a tall tree shaded the proximity of the portal, and there was a path of white stone leading from it toward. Some distance away, a pristine white wall rose higher than Sunny could see through the portal. Surrounded but the blue skis, clouds, and vibrant green grass, it seemed to be the epitome of beauty and tranquility. The whole site was like a paradise. He swallowed. The ivory tower, Mordred was right. What's more, judging by how softly the grass swayed under the wind and how lazily the branches of the tree moved, the heavenly island was really not affected by the crushing. In that regard, at least it was safe. Yes. Suddenly tense, Sunny quickly glanced at the circle of runes. Just as he had expected, it was already growing dimmer. The portal was burning through the meager amount of divine flame Sunny had been able to charge it within these past days, and was going to close soon. Curses! Well, it was not as though he had not been prepared to go through the arch as soon as it opened. He had done everything he wanted to do in the ebony tower, given the circumstances. There was not much to be done here to begin with. Time had destroyed every possible trophy he could have found, and the most valuable treasures, the bone weave and the knowledge of the map left behind by the prince of the underworld, were already in his possession. Now he just had to escape alive. Dismissing all of his memories, Sunny wrapped both shadows around his body and dashed toward the light. Please don't be an illusion. He appeared near the portal, dove inside and stumbled, falling to his knees. His fingers touched the soft grass, and with his tactile sense enhanced by the bone weave, Sunny felt every tiny detail of its texture, of the rich soil beneath, of the heat of the sun on his skin. It was all real. It was wonderful. As the portal shimmered and closed behind him, Sunny closed his eyes tightly and let out a short, quiet cry. He had too many emotions boiling in his heart to put them into words. He made it. He escaped from the void. He left nothing behind. While Sunny was feeling the joy of escaping from the sky below, something else happened. Somewhere far away, or maybe close by, there was a room built of cold stone, full of deafening silence. It was dark and empty, arranged in the shape of a heptagon, with 7 corners drowning in deep shadows. There were 7 mirrors standing at each of the 7 walls of the room, pointed at its center. There was nothing there. However, in each of the 7 mirrors, a figure of a young man reflected, sitting on the stone floor with his hands chained behind his back. The young man was still and motionless, almost as if he was just a statue and not a living being. But then something changed. A few moments after Sunny crossed the portal and appeared on the aisle of the ivory tower. One corner of the young man's lips curled upward slightly, forming a hint of a smile. Mordred was glad to see Sunny escape, too. "Saint, come look at this." Sunny sat on the soft grass, enjoying the sunlight and the cool wind. He had not even known how much he missed them. Missed everything, really. Looking back, it was hard to imagine that he had endured more than a month of utter nothingness without losing his mind. His experiences in the dark city, it seemed, made him far more resilient. The shadow of the ivory tower was slowly moving closer as the evening approached, marking the passage of time. It was peaceful and quiet on the green meadow of the heavenly island. Answering his call, the taciturn demon appeared nearby and stood silently, observing the magnificent white tower. Her ruby eyes, however, did not show any emotion. He sighed. "Well, I think it's lovely." The soaring island was not very large, so Sunny could more or less see its edge not too far away, surrounded by floating slates of shattered marble. There was a meadow on this side of it, a grove that rustled under the wind, and a graceful gazebo built of the same white material as the ivory tower itself. The stone arch inside of it was also white and empty. The portal was gone. Some distance away, connected to the gazebo by a stone path, stood the magnificent great pagoda that had once belonged to the demon of hope. If its copy in the sky below was somber and ominous, the original was the complete opposite. It was beautiful, graceful, and slightly surreal, as if too sublime to exist in the mortal realm. In a sense, it did not. Something about the ivory tower made Sunny uneasy, however. He couldn't quite describe the feeling, but it was as though he simultaneously felt pulled toward it and threatened by it. The sensation did not come from his intuition, but more so from the deepest corners of his soul. It was rather strong. And there was also something strange in the shape of the tower itself. There was a weird thing that went around the base of it, circling the whole perimeter of the great pagoda and disappearing from view. That thing was almost of the same color, but slightly less pristine, and made out of long and weathered sections. After looking at it for a while, Sunny finally realized what the thing was. Bone, wrapped around the tower, was what remained of the tail of some giant dead creature. He frowned. "Good thing it's dead. I hope it remains this way." Sunny sighed, used the cruel sight to help himself stand up, and headed toward the edge of the island. Saint followed, putting the blade of the midnight shard on her shoulder. Reaching it, he cautiously looked down and saw the disjointed patchwork of the chained aisles far below. From this high, they looked like pieces of a beautiful mosaic that someone had laid out on the backdrop of velvety darkness, with a scattering of radiant stars shining in between. Sunny gazed down for a while, then picked up a rock from the ground and threw it over the edge. The rock fell for 100 meters or so without meeting any resistance. Then, however, it suddenly cracked and exploded into shards, which then became dust and were scattered in the wind. And curses! It seemed that the crushing was still there. It's just that the ivory tower itself was not affected by it, as well as the island it stood upon and a small area surrounding it. How was he going to come down? Sunny stood at the edge for some time with a resentful expression on his face, then turned around and walked deeper into the island, circling the ivory tower from the left. On the other side of the great pagoda was a clear lake, with streams of water flowing out of it and falling over the edge of the island. In the bright sunlight, it seemed as though the entire surface of the lake was shining with pure golden radiance. Sunny looked at his reflection in the water, then at an intricately engraved bench standing near it, cut from white stone. Finally, he walked further on and reached a vantage point from which the gate of the graceful tower could be seen. Oh! The gates looked very similar to those he had opened in the depths of the sky below, with the main difference being the color and the absence of soot, as well as that there were skeletal remains of a giant beast lying in front of them, its serpentine body wrapped around the tower, its massive skull resting right near the tall white doors. Each of the terrifying fangs of the great beast was as long as Sunny was tall, at least. Deep darkness nestled in its empty eyes. He shivered. Is that a dragon? Indeed it was. Right in front of Sunny were the weathered, snow-white bones of an actual dragon. The image of the mighty creature laying dead in front of the pristine tower was solemn, mysterious, and terrifying. What could have killed such a being? Thinking that he didn't wish to know, Sunny lingered for a while, then headed toward the remains of the dragon. He was desperately hoping that the great beast would not stir and come to life. If that happened, well, it was better to not even think about it. Reaching the white skull of the mighty creature, Sunny hesitated for a bit, then walked between the terrifying fangs and approached the gates. They were slightly ajar, so he didn't even need to use essence to unlock them. Sunny gathered his courage, raised his hand and pushed the gates open. Suddenly, he felt a bit sleepy. What is this? Shaking his head to chase the sleepiness away, Sunny walked inside the tower and found himself in a great hall, bright light streaming through its tall windows. The air inside, however, was infused with a strange, shimmering darkness. And in its center there were chains. 7 chains sprawled from the pristine white floor, as if growing out of it, each ending in a broken shackle. The shackles were inscribed with a myriad of runes and marred, their metal torn. They were also the source of the strange shimmering, which rose from their surface in ethereal wisps. A chaotic, ever-changing mass of pure darkness pulsated in the very center of the great hall. No, it was not darkness. Rather, it seemed like a rift in the fabric of reality, one that could devour even light itself. Sunny tensed, then took a tentative step forward, hoping to see what was hidden behind the darkness. As soon as he did so, however, a familiar voice echoed in the silence of the great hall. Stop, Sunless. Turn back if you wish to live. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story, and if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.